Vietnam's history is marked by a continuous struggle for independence and sovereignty. This resilience was put to the test during the late 19th and early 20th centuries when Vietnam fell under French colonial rule. This period brought profound changes to Vietnamese society, economy, and politics, laying the groundwork for future conflicts and the eventual quest for independence.
Exciting update! Before we dive into today's video, I have some fantastic news for you. Have you ever wanted to learn Hebrew? Now's your perfect chance. We're offering an incredible opportunity to join our beginner Hebrew class, and the best part is, you set your own budget. Yes, you heard that right. You decide how much you want to invest in your Hebrew learning journey, and we'll review your registration to make it happen. Plus, to get you started, we're offering 3 free introductory classes, no strings attached, just an amazing opportunity to start learning Hebrew today.
Of a shoresh, one of our 3-letter shoresh is short shin. It means the future tense, you shall. Together all, pikudehem. Pikudehem. Together all, limate.
So, don't wait. Take control of your learning experience and dive into the rich world of Hebrew language and culture. Click the link in the description to sign up and begin your Hebrew journey now. Alright, let's get back to the video.
In 1887, Vietnam, along with Cambodia and Laos, became part of French Indochina. The French colonial administration was established to exploit the region's resources and integrate Vietnam into the global economy for the benefit of France. This colonial rule was characterized by a dual strategy of economic exploitation and cultural assimilation.
The French reoriented Vietnam's economy to serve their interests, focusing on the extraction of natural resources and the cultivation of cash crops. Large plantations were established to produce rubber, rice, and coffee, primarily for export. The infrastructure, including railways, roads, and ports, was developed to facilitate this economic exploitation.
However, these developments came at a significant cost to the Vietnamese people. Local farmers were often dispossessed of their lands and forced to work on plantations under harsh conditions for meager wages. The economic policies deepened social inequalities and created widespread poverty among the Vietnamese population.
The French colonial regime also sought to impose French culture and language on the Vietnamese. Western-style education systems were introduced, and French became the language of instruction and administration. The colonial authorities promoted Catholicism, leading to a significant number of conversions among the Vietnamese.
Despite these efforts, many Vietnamese resisted cultural assimilation, holding on to their traditional customs, language, and beliefs. This resistance to cultural imposition contributed to the growth of nationalist sentiments and the desire for independence.
As the French tightened their control over Vietnam, nationalist movements began to emerge, driven by a desire to reclaim sovereignty and restore national pride. These movements were inspired by both traditional Vietnamese values and modern ideologies.
One of the earliest and most influential nationalist leaders was Phan Boi Cho. In the early 1900s, he founded the Dong Du Eastern Study Movement, which encouraged Vietnamese youth to study in Japan. Phan Boi Cho believed that modern education and knowledge were essential for overthrowing French colonial rule and modernizing Vietnam. Although the Dong Du movement was eventually suppressed by the French, it inspired future generations of Vietnamese revolutionaries.
In 1919, A young Vietnamese revolutionary named Nguyen Ai Quoc, who later took the name Ho Chi Minh, presented a petition for Vietnamese independence at the Versailles Peace Conference. Although his pleas were ignored, Nguyen Ai Quoc continued his activism, advocating for Vietnamese independence and socialism. In 1930, he founded the Indochinese Communist Party ICP, which played a crucial role in organizing anti-colonial activities and mobilizing the Vietnamese population against French rule.
Throughout the colonial period, Vietnamese nationalists faced severe repression from the French authorities. Leaders were arrested, movements were suppressed, and uprisings were brutally crushed. Despite these challenges, the desire for independence continued to grow, fueled by the injustices and hardships imposed by colonial rule.
By the early 1940s, Vietnam was ripe for revolution. The economic exploitation, cultural imposition, and political repression of French colonial rule had created a groundswell of nationalist fervor. The fall of France to Nazi Germany in 1940 and the subsequent Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II further weakened French control and emboldened Vietnamese nationalists.
In 1941, the Viet Minh, a coalition of communist and nationalist forces led by Ho Chi Minh, was established to fight both Japanese occupiers and French colonialists. This marked the beginning of a new and more intense phase of the Vietnamese struggle for independence, which would eventually lead to the First Indochina War and the broader conflict known as the Vietnam War.
The period of French colonial rule in Vietnam was marked by profound changes and deep-seated resistance, economic exploitation, cultural assimilation, and social upheaval under French domination, sowed the seeds of nationalism and set the stage for future revolutionary movements. The resilience and determination of the Vietnamese people during this era laid the foundation for their eventual struggle for independence and the subsequent conflicts that would shape the nation's history.
The First Indochina War, fought between the French colonial forces and the Viet Minh, began in 1946 and ended in 1954. This war was a crucial phase in Vietnam's struggle for independence and set the stage for the Vietnam War that followed. It was a complex conflict influenced by global post-World War II geopolitics, colonial ambitions, and nationalist movements.
Ho Chi Minh, leader of the Viet Minh League for the Independence of Vietnam, declared Vietnam's independence from France, citing the principles of self-determination championed by the Allies during World War II. This declaration followed Japan's surrender and the end of its occupation of Vietnam. Despite Ho Chi Minh's declaration, the French sought to reassert their colonial control over Vietnam. Initial negotiations between the French and the Viet Minh led to a fragile agreement, but tensions soon escalated into open conflict. The First Indochina War officially began when the Viet Minh launched attacks against French forces in Hanoi. The conflict quickly spread, with the Viet Minh employing guerrilla tactics and gaining support from the rural population, while the French controlled urban areas and major transport routes. The French launched Operation Leah, a major offensive aimed at capturing Ho Chi Minh and destroying the Viet Minh's base in northern Vietnam. While the French managed to inflict significant damage, they failed to capture Ho Chi Minh or decisively defeat the Viet Minh. The Chinese Communist victory in the Chinese Civil War provided the Viet Minh with a crucial ally. China began supplying the Viet Minh with weapons, training, and support, significantly strengthening their position. The Battle of Route Coloniale IV was a significant Viet Minh victory, capturing large quantities of French supplies and marking a turning point in the war. The Viet Minh's growing strength and the increasing cost of the war began to strain French resources and resolve. The First Indochina War was heavily influenced by the broader context of the Cold War. The United States, fearing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, provided substantial financial and military aid to the French. Conversely, the Soviet Union and China supported the Viet Minh, viewing the conflict as part of the global struggle against Western imperialism. The decisive moment of the First Indochina War came with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French established a fortified garrison at Dien Bien Phu, intending to lure the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle. However, the Viet Minh, under General Vuong Nguyen Giap, besieged the garrison, utilizing extensive trench networks and artillery. After a prolonged and brutal siege, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu fell to the Viet Minh. This defeat had a profound impact on French morale and political will, effectively signaling the end of French colonial ambitions in Indochina. The Geneva Conference was convened to negotiate a settlement to the conflict. The resulting Geneva Accords called for a temporary division of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, with the Viet Minh controlling the north and the French-supported state of Vietnam controlling the south. The Accords also stipulated that national elections were to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. However, the elections were never held, and the temporary division of Vietnam became permanent, setting the stage for the Vietnam War.
The First Indochina War was a pivotal conflict in Vietnamese history, marking the end of French colonial rule and the beginning of Vietnam's division. It was characterized by fierce fighting, significant international involvement, and the emergence of the Viet Minh as a formidable military and political force. The war's legacy influenced subsequent conflicts in Vietnam and shaped the broader geopolitical landscape of the Cold War era.
Following the Geneva Accords of 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, with the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, and the Anti-Communist Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, led by President Ngo Dinh Diem. The intended reunification elections never occurred, leading to a tense and volatile situation.
After the Geneva Accords, the United States began to support Ngo Dinh Diem, seeing him as a bulwark against communism in Southeast Asia. Diem refused to hold the reunification elections, claiming that the communists would not conduct free elections in the north. The U.S. Military Assistance Advisory Group, MAAG, was established in South Vietnam to train and assist the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. U.S. aid increased substantially, with economic and military assistance aimed at stabilizing Diem's government. Diem consolidated his power through a series of measures, including the suppression of political opponents and the elimination of rival religious and political groups. His authoritarian rule and favoritism towards Catholics alienated many Buddhists and other groups in South Vietnam. The Viet Cong, VC, a communist insurgency in the south supported by North Vietnam, began guerrilla warfare against Diem's government. The conflict started as localized skirmishes but gradually escalated. North Vietnam decided to escalate its support for the Viet Cong, establishing the Ho Chi Minh Trail to supply arms and troops to the south. This network of jungle paths and tunnels ran through Laos and Cambodia, bypassing the 17th parallel. The National Liberation Front, NLF, was officially formed to unite various anti-Diem groups under communist leadership. The NLF, also known as the Viet Cong, intensified its insurgent activities, challenging Diem's control over South Vietnam. Newly elected President John F. Kennedy significantly increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Kennedy sent additional military advisors to South Vietnam, bringing their number from around 700 to over 16,000 by the end of his presidency. He also authorized the use of Agent Orange and other herbicides to defoliate jungle areas and disrupt Viet Cong supply lines. The Strategic Hamlet Program was launched, aiming to isolate the Viet Cong from the rural population by relocating villagers to fortified settlements. However, the program was poorly implemented, leading to widespread resentment and further alienating rural communities from the Diem government. Diem's repressive policies towards Buddhists led to widespread protests and a crisis of legitimacy for his government. The self-immolation of Thich Quang Duc, a Buddhist monk, in Saigon captured international attention and highlighted Diem's oppressive regime. With the tacit approval of the US, a group of South Vietnamese generals staged a coup, overthrowing and assassinating Ngo Dinh Diem. This event marked a significant turning point, leading to political instability and a series of successive governments in South Vietnam.
The period from 1955 to 1963 saw the transformation of U.S. involvement in Vietnam from advisory and support roles to direct engagement and deeper commitment. The increasing presence of American advisors, military aid, and economic support was driven by the Cold War imperative to contain communism. However, these efforts often backfired, contributing to the instability and unpopularity of the South Vietnamese government. The assassination of Diem and the political chaos that followed left South Vietnam vulnerable and more dependent on American support. This period laid the groundwork for the further escalation of U.S. involvement, leading to the deployment of combat troops and the full-scale military engagement that defined the Vietnam War.
The period from 1964 to 1968 marked a significant escalation of the Vietnam War, with increased U.S. military involvement and major combat operations. This era saw the transition from an advisory and support role to full-scale military engagement, driven by Cold War dynamics and the desire to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident involved two alleged attacks by North Vietnamese forces on U.S. naval vessels, the USS Maddox and the USS Turner Joy. The details of the attacks were later questioned, but they provided a pretext for escalating U.S. involvement. In response to the incident, the U.S. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson broad authority to use military force in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. This resolution marked a turning point, leading to increased U.S. military engagement. The U.S. launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam. The operation aimed to weaken North Vietnamese infrastructure, disrupt supply lines, and diminish the Viet Cong's capacity to operate in the South. Despite extensive bombing, the operation failed to achieve its strategic objectives and often strengthened North Vietnamese resolve. The first U.S. combat troops, primarily Marines, arrived in South Vietnam, marking the beginning of direct American military involvement. The troop presence grew rapidly, with more than 200,000 U.S. soldiers deployed by the end of 1965. The U.S. conducted several major operations to combat the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army. The first major offensive operation by U.S. Marines aimed at eliminating Viet Cong forces near Chu Lai. A large-scale search and destroy mission in Binh Dinh province designed to disrupt Viet Cong operations. The conflict intensified with several significant battles. A series of engagements in the Central Highlands, resulting in heavy casualties for both sides. The largest airborne operation of the war, targeting Viet Cong base areas near the Cambodian border. The Tet Offensive, a coordinated series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and NVA on over 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, marked a critical juncture in the war. The offensive included assaults on key targets such as the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and the ancient city of Hue. Despite heavy losses, the Tet Offensive had a profound psychological impact. It shattered the perception of imminent victory promoted by U.S. officials and significantly shifted American public opinion against the war. The widespread devastation and high casualty rates also strained U.S. military and political resources. The escalation of the Vietnam War led to growing anti-war sentiment and social upheaval in the United States. Major protests, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience highlighted widespread opposition to the war, particularly among young Americans and the counterculture movement. The My Lai massacre, where U.S. soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians, further fueled anti-war sentiment and raised serious ethical questions about U.S. conduct in Vietnam. Facing mounting criticism and a deeply divided nation, President Lyndon B. Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. He also called for peace negotiations to end the war. Richard Nixon was elected president, promising to achieve peace with honor and reduce American involvement in Vietnam.
The period from 1964 to 1968 marked a significant escalation in the Vietnam War, characterized by major combat operations and increased U.S. military involvement. Key events such as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Operation Rolling Thunder, and the Tet Offensive had profound impacts on the course of the war and American public opinion. The political and social turmoil in the United States, combined with the heavy human and material costs of the conflict, set the stage for subsequent efforts to de-escalate and seek a resolution to the war.
This would have been an easy thing to do. It might have been a popular thing to do. But I would have betrayed my solemn responsibility as President of the United States if I had done so. I want to end this war. The American people want to end this war.
During this period, the U.S. sought to reduce its involvement in Vietnam through a strategy called Vietnamization, aimed at building up South Vietnamese forces to take over the combat role, allowing U.S. troops to withdraw.
President Richard Nixon introduced Vietnamization, emphasizing the training and equipping of South Vietnamese forces, ARVN, to gradually take over combat operations, reduce American casualties and enable a phased withdrawal of U.S. troops while maintaining a non-communist South Vietnam. Nixon began withdrawing U.S. troops, with the first major reduction announced in June. Over 400,000 American troops were withdrawn, with troop levels decreasing from over 500,000 to fewer than 30,000. U.S. and ARVN forces launched a joint invasion into Cambodia to target Viet Cong and NVA sanctuaries. This expansion of the war sparked widespread protests in the United States. The invasion of Cambodia led to increased anti-war protests, culminating in the shooting of 4 students by the National Guard at Kent State University, galvanizing opposition to the war. An ARVN-led incursion into Laos aimed at cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The operation faced stiff resistance, resulting in significant ARVN casualties and questioning the effectiveness of Vietnamization. Formal negotiations in Paris involved the U.S., South Vietnam, North Vietnam, and the Viet Cong. Talks were frequently stalled due to disagreements over terms, enter text. Increased diplomatic efforts, including secret negotiations between Nixon's National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese Representative Lưu Duc Tho. North Vietnam launched the Easter Offensive, a large-scale invasion aimed at breaking South Vietnamese resistance and forcing U.S. concessions. The ARVN, with U.S. air support, managed to halt the offensive but suffered heavy casualties. In response to the Easter Offensive, Nixon ordered massive bombing campaigns, Operation Linebacker 1 and 2, against North Vietnamese targets, demonstrating continued U.S. military might and pressuring North Vietnam to negotiate. After intense negotiations, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, establishing a ceasefire and outlining the withdrawal of remaining U.S. forces. Key provisions included withdrawal of U.S. troops, return of prisoners of war, recognition of the demilitarized zone. At the 17th parallel, political provisions for South Vietnam's future, including the possibility of free elections. The last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam, marking the end of direct American military involvement. Although U.S. military presence ended, the conflict between North and South Vietnam continued, with limited U.S. air support and aid to South Vietnam.
The period from 1969 to 1973 was marked by efforts to transfer the war effort to South Vietnamese forces while reducing U.S. involvement. Nixon's policy of Vietnamization aimed to secure a peace with honor, but faced challenges, including intense combat, domestic protests, and difficult negotiations. The eventual signing of the Paris Peace Accords provided a temporary resolution, but the conflict's underlying issues persisted, setting the stage for future conflict in Vietnam.
After the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, a fragile ceasefire was established between North and South Vietnam. However, hostilities soon resumed, leading to the rapid collapse of South Vietnam.
As U.S. military support dwindled, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, increased pressure on South Vietnam. President Richard Nixon's resignation in August 1974 weakened U.S. commitment, and subsequent American aid to South Vietnam was significantly reduced. South Vietnam faced severe economic difficulties, including inflation and fuel shortages, which undermined its military capabilities. The ARVN struggled with low morale and insufficient resources. The NVA launched a major offensive, capturing the strategically important province of Phuc Long. The U.S. response was limited, signaling to North Vietnam that significant American intervention was unlikely. The NVA initiated a full-scale assault on the Central Highlands, rapidly overrunning ARVN forces. The fall of key cities like Banh Mi Thuot marked the beginning of a swift military collapse. The ARVN's retreat from the Central Highlands turned chaotic, with widespread panic among troops and civilians. The lack of U.S. support led to a crisis of confidence in South Vietnamese leadership. Major cities in the north, including Hue and Da Nang, fell to the NVA in quick succession. The rapid advance overwhelmed South Vietnamese defenses and led to mass evacuations. As North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon, the capital, South Vietnam's government struggled to maintain control. President Nguyen Van Thieu resigned on April 21st, leaving a power vacuum. The U.S. organized the evacuation of American personnel and at-risk South Vietnamese civilians through Operation Frequent Wind, one of the largest helicopter evacuations in history. NVA tanks entered Saigon, meeting little resistance. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the Vietnam War, with the official surrender of South Vietnam and the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. Vietnam was officially reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam in July 1976. The new government faced significant challenges, including rebuilding a war-torn nation and integrating the North and South. The war's end triggered a humanitarian crisis, with many South Vietnamese facing persecution, leading to a mass exodus of refugees known as the Boat People. The Vietnam War left deep scars, with millions of Vietnamese and over 58,000 Americans dead. It also had profound effects on U.S. domestic politics and foreign policy, shaping American views on military intervention for decades.
The fall of Saigon in 1975 was a dramatic and definitive end to the Vietnam War, symbolizing the failure of U.S. policy in Southeast Asia and the triumph of Vietnamese nationalism. It marked the beginning of a new, challenging chapter for Vietnam as it embarked on the path of rebuilding and reconciliation.
Post-1975, aftermath of the Vietnam War. Reunification and Reconstruction. July 2, 1976, Vietnam was officially reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, with Hanoi as the capital. The war-torn country faced significant challenges, including infrastructure destruction, a shattered economy, and the integration of North and South. The government implemented collectivization of agriculture and nationalization of industry, which initially led to economic difficulties and food shortages. Vietnam faced international isolation, particularly from Western nations, due to its communist regime and occupation of Cambodia. Hundreds of thousands fled Vietnam, fearing persecution. Many became known as the Boat People, facing dangerous journeys to seek refuge in other countries. Many Vietnamese refugees were resettled in the United States, Canada, Australia, and other countries, forming vibrant expatriate communities. Cambodian occupation, 1978 to 1989. Vietnam invaded Cambodia in 1978 to overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime, leading to a prolonged military presence that further strained the Vietnamese economy and relations with China and the West. Sino-Vietnamese War, 1979. Tensions with China escalated into a brief but bloody border war, further isolating Vietnam internationally. 1986. The Vietnamese government launched Doi Moi Renovation, a series of economic reforms aimed at transitioning from a centrally planned economy to a more market-oriented one. These reforms led to significant economic growth, poverty reduction, and increased foreign investment, gradually integrating Vietnam into the global economy. The war left a lasting impact on veterans from all sides, with many suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and other war-related traumas. The use of chemical defoliants, such as Agent Orange, resulted in long-term health issues and environmental damage, affecting millions of Vietnamese and U.S. veterans. Vietnam-U.S. relations. Over time, diplomatic relations between Vietnam and the United States improved, culminating in the normalization of relations in 1995. Memorials and museums in Vietnam and the U.S. commemorate the conflict, fostering reflection on the war's legacy. The Vietnam War profoundly influenced art, literature, and film, shaping how the conflict is remembered and understood globally. The aftermath of the Vietnam War was marked by significant challenges, including economic hardships, international isolation, and a refugee crisis. However, Vietnam's eventual economic reforms and efforts to rebuild the nation paved the way for recovery and development. The war's legacy continues to resonate, influencing both Vietnam and the global community in profound ways.